Welcome to Beyond the Blue Planet, the podcast where we explore the history of space conquest. I'm Domenica, and in this episode, we will talk about the Gemini missions, the orbiting laboratory that paved the way for humanity's arrival on the moon. If the Mercury program was the first step, Gemini was the trial by fire that led us to Apollo's great leap. Join me on this journey. We are in the middle of the Cold War, and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union is at its peak. The USSR had achieved the first major milestones: the Sputnik satellite, the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. The United States had to respond. The Mercury program proved that astronauts could go to space and return alive. But to reach the moon, more tests were needed. How do we dock two spacecraft in orbit? How do we survive longer missions? Can we walk in space safely? This is where the Gemini program comes in. The Gemini missions were designed as an intermediate phase between the first space flights and the moon landing. They aimed to develop essential techniques: extended space flights, extravehicular activities, and orbital rendezvous and docking.
The Gemini program, named after the constellation of the twins, was fundamental for lunar exploration. It included 10 manned missions between 1965 and 1966, with the goal of developing and testing the essential maneuvers required to reach the moon. One of the biggest challenges was the extravehicular activity. Ed White, an astronaut on Gemini 4, was the first American to exit the capsule and float in space. But things were not as easy as they seemed. The suit was rigid, movements were difficult, and getting back into the spacecraft was a real challenge. To understand the importance of this moment, imagine being suspended in space with only a tether connecting the astronaut to the spacecraft. Any mistake could be fatal, and life support systems needed to be tested in a real microgravity environment. Another key achievement was orbital docking. Gemini 8, commanded by Neil Armstrong, successfully docked with an unmanned vehicle in space. However, a thruster malfunction nearly ended in disaster. Armstrong, with his characteristic calm, managed to stabilize the spacecraft and return safely. Without these tests, Apollo 11 would not have been possible. Another crucial aspect of the Gemini program was human endurance. In missions like Gemini 7, astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell spent 14 days in space, the longest at that time studying the effects of microgravity on the human body. This experiment was essential for future long-duration missions, such as those on the International Space Station. Gemini was a short program, but its lessons were crucial. This is where astronauts who would later go to the moon, like Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, were trained. Navigation systems were perfected, the effects of weightlessness on the human body were studied, and the feasibility of long-duration missions was demonstrated. Additionally, it allowed for the testing of precise re-entry and landing, something fundamental for safely returning from the moon. The Gemini capsules were designed to maneuver during re-entry, allowing for a more controlled landing than previous Mercury missions. Thanks to Gemini, NASA had confidence that the next big step, Apollo 11, was possible. Without this program, the dream of walking on the moon would have taken much longer to become a reality.
And that concludes today's episode on the Gemini program, a true orbiting laboratory that brought us one step closer to the moon. This program laid the foundation for many of the techniques we still use in space exploration today, from orbital docking to spacewalks and studies on human endurance in space. Next time, we will talk about the most important moment in the history of space exploration, Apollo 11, the giant leap for humanity. If you enjoyed this episode, share it and follow us for more stories about space exploration. See you on the next mission.